had been on the road for so long that the dust had become part of me. It settled in the creases of my hands, in the folds of my coat, and in the corners of my eyes no matter how often I wiped them. My old brown horse, Brim, moved with the steady patience of an animal that had carried too many miles and too few comforts. His coat was rough from wind and sun, and his steps had grown slower with each passing season, yet he never once complained. Between us we carried everything I owned: a bag of tools, a coil of rope, a few coins, and the stubborn habit of stopping wherever someone's land was dying. That spring I rode into Ravenmoor as the light was fading. The town sat at the edge of the borderlands where the last proper roads gave way to narrower tracks that led into orc territory. I planned to water the horse, eat something hot, and leave at first light. The tavern was small and low-ceilinged, filled with the smell of wet wool and sour ale. I took a bench near the wall and listened while I ate. 3 men sat at the back table. Their voices carried easily over the low murmur of the room. "The orchard's half dead already," one of them said. "Another season like this and the whole place will be worthless." "Land that size, with water running the wrong way," another answered. "Won't take much before she has to sell. And when she does, the price will be low enough to make it worth the trouble." They spoke of a farm to the north. Good soil once, they said, but now the fields on the western side were waterlogged in spring and baked hard by summer. The apple trees were failing. The woman who owned it was alone. They laughed when they mentioned her name, though they never said it outright. They only called her the Orc Widow and spoke of how the land had turned against her. I finished my meal and asked the innkeeper about the farm. He was an older man with tired eyes. He wiped the counter for a moment before answering. "That would be Veressa Thornfield's place," he said quietly. "Husband died 3 years back. People say the ground there is cursed. Most folk keep their distance." I thanked him and left. Outside, the night air was cold and clean. I stood for a while looking north, toward the dark line of hills. I had seen farms die before. Sometimes it was weather. Sometimes it was neglect. And sometimes it was something else entirely. Something people chose not to name because naming it would mean doing something about it. At dawn, I rode out. The track climbed gently through open pasture before dropping into a shallow valley. The farm lay spread across the slope below me. Wide fields of dark earth, a long line of apple trees running along the eastern fence, and a large timber barn standing solid against the morning light. From a distance, it looked like a place that should have been thriving. Up close, the signs were clearer. Water stood in the wrong places. The western fields were soft underfoot even though the rest of the valley had already begun to dry. I dismounted and knelt to take a handful of soil. It was heavy with clay and still held the memory of standing water. I followed the old drainage line on foot until I reached the second spillway. There the main ditch had collapsed inward. Stones that should have guided the flow had shifted and settled into a blockage. Roots from an old tree had pushed through the bank and finished the job. The water had nowhere to go except sideways, into the fields that needed it least. I was still studying the break when a voice spoke behind me. "If you have come to buy the land cheap, you are late." I turned. She stood near the fence with a wooden bucket in one hand. She was tall, taller than most men I knew, with broad shoulders and skin the deep green of old forest shade. Her black hair was pulled back tightly from her face. She wore a faded work dress and heavy boots caked with mud. In her other hand, she carried a small sack of grain. Her eyes were the color of dark honey, and they watched me without blinking. I straightened. "The ditch under the second spillway has fallen in," I said. "Water cannot drain. That is why the western fields are dying." She did not answer at once. She looked past me toward the broken channel, then back at my face. "3 others came before you," she said. "They all spoke of bad weather and poor luck." "I am not here for the land," I told her. She waited. "I can fix the ditch," I said. "It will take time and labor, but it can be done. In return, I ask only to sleep in your barn and to feed my horse on your hay. When the work is finished, I will leave." She studied me for a long moment. The wind moved across the grass between us. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed. "You would sleep in the barn," she repeated, as if testing the words for hidden meaning. "I have slept in worse places." Her gaze dropped to the tools hanging from my saddle, then returned to my face. "What is your name?" I told her. She nodded once, slowly. "Very well," she said. "You may begin tomorrow. The barn is dry enough and there is hay. Do not expect more than that." "I do not." She turned and walked back toward the house without another word. I watched her go, the bucket swinging at her side, her steps steady on the uneven ground. That evening, I led Brim into the barn and spread my blanket over a clean patch of straw. The air smelled of old wood and dry grass. I had just sat down when footsteps came running across the yard. A boy appeared in the doorway. He was perhaps 12, with the same green skin as the woman and hair that fell into his eyes. He stopped when he saw me and caught his breath. "Mother says you are to come inside," he announced. "She has set a place for you." I looked past him toward the house. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney. The windows showed warm light. I folded the blanket and stood. The boy waited until I reached the door, then ran ahead. When I stepped into the main room, the smell of stew and fresh bread met me. She stood at the long wooden table, placing a third bowl beside the two already set. She did not look up at once. When she did, her expression was unreadable. "Sit," she said. "The food will grow cold." I pulled out the chair she had placed for me. The wood was smooth from years of use. Across the table, the boy watched me with open curiosity. She sat last between us and poured water into 3 cups. Outside, the wind moved through the apple trees. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth. For the first time in many nights, I ate at a table instead of beside a road. She did not ask questions. The boy did not speak. Yet the silence that filled the room was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of a place that had been waiting for someone to stop moving long enough to notice it was still alive. I sat at the long oak table that first evening and felt the weight of the empty chair across from me. Veressa placed a bowl of venison stew in front of me without ceremony. The steam rose between us, carrying the scent of thyme and root vegetables. Lior, the boy, watched me from his seat with the open curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to hide his thoughts. He was perhaps 12, all long limbs and sharp eyes, his green skin a shade lighter than his mother's. She sat last and poured water into 3 cups. "This is my son," she said. "Lior." The boy nodded once, then asked without preamble, "Do you really know how to dig ditches?" I tore a piece of black bread and dipped it into the stew. If I did not, I would already be eating for free. He considered that, then smiled, small and quick. Veressa did not smile, but the line of her shoulders eased by a fraction. We ate in near silence. The only sounds were the crack of the fire and the occasional scrape of spoon against bowl. It was not an uncomfortable quiet. It was the quiet of people who had grown used to speaking only when words were necessary. When the meal ended, I stood and reached for my coat. "The barn is warm enough," I said. Veressa looked at me across the table. "The nights are still cold. Sleep where you like." I nodded and left. Outside, the stars were sharp above the valley. I walked to the barn, spread my blanket over fresh straw, and lay down listening to Brim shift in his stall. Sleep came slowly. I kept seeing the third place setting at the table and the way Veressa had set it without asking whether I would return. At first light, I began work on the ditch. The collapse was worse than it had appeared. The main channel under the second spillway had given way where the old stone lining had shifted. Water had undermined the bank, and a tangle of roots from a nearby oak had pushed through the gap, locking the blockage in place. Each time rain came, more soil washed sideways into the western fields. The land there was already sour and heavy. Veressa came out while I was still clearing the first layer of fallen stone. She carried a shovel and a length of rope. She did not ask permission. She simply stepped down into the shallow trench and began pulling roots free with her hands. Her fingers were strong and sure. She knew exactly where the soil would hold and where it would crumble. We worked without speaking for most of the morning. When I needed her to hold a stake so I could measure the fall of the ground, she was already there. When she pointed out a better angle for the new channel, I understood at once why it would work. She knew this land the way a person knows the lines of their own palm. She could read where water wanted to go and where it had been forced. By midday, Lior had appeared with a bucket of water and bread. He stayed to watch. Every question he asked was direct. Why does the water have to slope exactly this much? Because if it slopes too little, it pools. If it slopes too much, it cuts the banks away. He nodded and repeated the words under his breath as if storing them. When I showed him how to pack the new stones so they would lock against one another, he tried it himself. His first attempt was clumsy. His second was better. Veressa watched from the edge of the trench but said nothing. I answered every question Lior asked with the same seriousness I would have given an adult. The boy deserved that much. We continued through the afternoon. The sun moved across the valley and the air grew warmer. Veressa worked beside me without complaint, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her arms streaked with mud. Once, when a section of bank threatened to slide, she braced it with her shoulder while I drove in a new stake. Our hands brushed when I reached for the mallet. Neither of us pulled away at once. That evening, I returned to the barn as before. I had just begun to unroll my blanket when I heard footsteps. It was Lior again. "Mother says the stew is still hot," he announced. "She set your place." I looked toward the house. The windows glowed. I folded the blanket and followed him. Inside, Veressa was ladling stew into bowls. She had added a fourth chair to the table, though only 3 of us would use it. I sat in the same seat as the night before. The fire had been built higher. The room felt less empty. We ate. Lior talked more this time, describing a bird he had seen near the orchard and asking whether its nest could be moved without harm. I told him what I knew. Veressa listened. When the meal was finished, she did not rise at once. She remained at the table, hands wrapped around her cup. 3 years, she said quietly. Since my husband died, no one has sat in that chair. She did not look at me when she spoke. Her eyes were on the empty place across from her. I said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. I only stayed where I was until she stood and began clearing the bowls. The next days followed the same pattern. We worked on the ditch from dawn until the light faded. Veressa's knowledge of the land continued to surprise me. She could tell by the color of the soil how long it had held water and whether the clay beneath would drain once the channel was clear. She showed me where the old fence lines had once guided runoff and where new cuts would serve better. We fell into a rhythm that required few words. A glance, a nod, a shift of weight, and the other understood. Lior followed me whenever his chores allowed. He asked about tools, about the weight of stone, about why some woods lasted longer in wet ground than others. I answered each question plainly. Once, when he grew frustrated with a knot that would not loosen, I showed him how to work the rope rather than fight it. He learned quickly. Veressa watched these exchanges from a distance. I could feel her attention even when she said nothing. On the 5th day, I rode into Ravenmoor for nails and rope. The moment I stepped into the ironmonger's, the talk at the counter stopped. 2 men I did not recognize looked at me, then at each other. One of them smiled without warmth. "Sleeping in the Orc widow's barn, are you?" he said. "Must be comfortable." I paid for what I needed and left without answering. Outside, the street felt narrower than it had the week before. I understood then that Veressa had endured these looks and these words for 3 years. She had carried them alone while the land failed around her and no one offered help. That evening, when I finished work and turned toward the barn, Veressa was waiting at the kitchen door. She held a clean cloth in one hand. "The nights are turning colder," she said. "Eat first. The barn will still be there when you are done." She did not wait for my reply. She turned and went inside. I stood for a moment in the yard, the cloth in my hand, the weight of the day still in my shoulders. Then I followed her. Inside, the table was set for 3. My bowl had already been filled. Lior was already seated, waiting. Veressa stood by the hearth, her back to me, stirring the pot, though it did not need stirring. I pulled out the chair and sat. The fire crackled. Steam rose from the bowls. For the first time since I had arrived, I did not feel like a man who was merely passing through. I felt like someone who had been expected. 3 weeks passed before the water began to move the way it should. The ditch held. The stones locked against one another, and the new channel cut a clean line down the slope. On the morning the first clear stream reached the western fields, Veressa stood at the edge of the pasture and watched without speaking. The soil there had already begun to darken from wet to workable. Beyond it, the apple trees showed new green at the tips of their branches. She did not smile. She only stood with her hands loose at her sides, her shoulders lower than they had been when I first arrived. I saw the shine in her eyes before she turned away. That same afternoon, an old man rode up the track on a gray mule. I recognized him from the tavern in Ravenmoor. Helmar, the ironmonger. He carried no tools this time, only a leather satchel and a face that looked older than his years. Veressa invited him inside. I stayed in the yard until she called my name. We sat at the long table with cups of weak ale. Helmar turned his cup slowly between his hands before he spoke. 2 men came to my shop last week, he said. They asked whether anyone had been working on your drainage. When I told them a stranger had been seen on the land, they left without buying anything. He looked at Veressa. They are the same 2 who have been waiting for this place to fail. They knew the ditch was blocked. They knew it 3 seasons ago. They paid a boy to keep quiet about what he saw when the stones first shifted. Veressa's fingers tightened around her cup until the knuckles showed pale against her green skin. They told people it was the weather, Helmar continued. They told people the land had turned against you. They wanted you to believe it yourself. She set the cup down carefully. For a moment she said nothing. Then she pushed her chair back and stood. "Excuse me," she said, and walked out through the kitchen door into the yard. I found her later near the barn, standing with her back to the house. Her arms were crossed tight over her chest. She did not look at me when I stopped beside her. "I thought I was failing him," she said. Her voice was low and rough. "I thought I was not strong enough to keep what my husband left for Lior. Every season the water rose and the trees sickened, and I told myself I had done something wrong, that I had missed something, that the land itself had decided I did not belong here." "You did not miss anything," I said. "Someone chose to let it die." She turned then. Her eyes were dry but bright with anger that had nowhere to go. "They waited," she said. "They watched, and they waited while I worked myself into the ground, and I let them." "No," I said, "you survived them. That is not the same thing." She searched my face for a long moment. The wind moved between us, carrying the smell of turned earth and new leaves. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "When you could have taken your pay and gone, why did you stay?" I had not spoken of it to anyone in years. The words felt heavy in my mouth. "My father lost his farm the same way," I said. "A man he trusted told him the water was bad and the soil was spent. My father believed him. He sold for almost nothing. 2 seasons later, the same man was working the land with new ditches and new seed. My father died the winter after that. He died believing he had been too weak to hold what was his." Veressa was quiet. She did not offer pity. She only stood with me until the light began to fade. After that day, the house changed in small ways I could not name at first. Each morning when I came in from the barn, a cup of hot tea waited on the bench by the door. Veressa never mentioned it. She simply set it there and continued with her own work. In the afternoon, she sometimes left a piece of fresh bread wrapped in cloth beside my tools. At night, after Lior had gone to bed, she began to sit with me on the bench outside the kitchen door. We did not speak much. We listened to the crickets and the sound of water moving where it had not moved in years. The silence between us was no longer empty. It had become something we both chose. One evening she brought me a clean cloth for my hands. I had been working late and my fingers were stained dark with soil and rust. She held the cloth out. When I reached for it, our hands met. Her skin was warm and rough from work. She did not pull away at once. Neither did I. We stood like that for several heartbeats, the cloth between us, the evening air cool on our arms. Then she let go. I watched her walk back into the house. My hand still felt the shape of hers. That night I gathered my blanket as usual and turned toward the barn. Veressa stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded. The light from the fire outlined her against the dark. "If you say again that you will sleep in the barn," she said, "I will begin to think you find my cooking beneath you." I stopped. The blanket was heavy in my arms. "I do not," I said. "Then come inside." She did not wait for an answer. She turned and walked back to the hearth. I stood in the yard a moment longer, listening to the wind move through the apple trees. Then I carried my blanket into the house. I laid it on the bench near the fire as she had told me to do on the first night. Lior was already asleep in the loft. Veressa sat at the table with her hands around a cup. She did not look up when I entered, but she did not tell me to leave. I lay down on the bench. The fire had burned low. For the first time since I had come to this place, I did not hear the sound of my own footsteps walking away. I heard only the quiet breathing of the house and the steady movement of water somewhere beyond the walls. Sleep came without the weight I had carried for so long. I did not dream of roads. I dreamed of nothing at all. The work was finished by the first week of autumn. The water ran clean through the new channel and reached the western fields without pooling. The apple trees had put on new growth, and the leaves were a deeper green than they had been in years. The soil that had been sour and heavy now crumbled properly underfoot. I walked the length of the ditch one morning and saw that everything I had come to repair was working as it should. There was nothing left for me to do. I'd always left places when the work was done. That was the pattern I knew. Stay until the job was finished, then move on before anything could take root. The thought of staying here now made something tighten in my chest. It was not the land that frightened me. It was the quiet way the house had begun to feel like it expected me each morning. The cup of tea that appeared on the bench without being asked for. Lior's questions that no longer felt like the curiosity of a stranger. Veressa's presence at the table, steady and silent and no longer edged with suspicion. I told myself it was time. I began with the small things. I checked Brim's saddle and oiled the leather. I rolled my blanket tighter than usual and packed the few tools that were truly mine into the saddlebag. I did it early, before the light was full so no one would see. Veressa noticed anyway. She said nothing when she passed me in the yard, but her eyes lingered on the saddle for a moment longer than they needed to. She turned away and went back to the house without a word. That afternoon, Lior found me near the barn. He had been helping me carry stones the day before, and his hands were still marked with the dust of the work. He stood in the doorway and watched me fold a length of rope. "You are leaving," he said. It was not a question. I kept my hands busy. "The ditch is finished. The water moves where it should. There is nothing more for me to do here." He was quiet for a while, then he said, "I thought you would stay." The words landed harder than I expected. I looked at him. He was still a boy, but there was something older in the way he held himself, as if he had already learned that people left and did not always come back. "I was only ever passing through," I said. He nodded once, the way his mother sometimes did when she accepted something she did not like. Then he turned and walked back toward the house without another word. That evening, I stayed outside longer than usual. I sat on the bench by the kitchen door and listened to the wind move through the apple trees. The air smelled of wood smoke and turned earth. I told myself I would leave at first light. It would be cleaner that way. Veressa came out after Lior had gone to bed. She closed the door behind her and stood for a moment with her arms crossed. The light from the fire inside outlined her against the dark. "You are going," she said. I did not look at her. "The work is done." She stepped closer. "That is not what I asked." I stood because sitting made me feel smaller than I wanted to feel. "I do not want to become a burden to you." She gave a short, quiet laugh that held no humor. "You repaired the ditch that 3 seasons of neglect and 2 men's greed had left to rot. You taught my son how to set stone so it will not shift again. You have eaten at my table and slept under my roof without asking for anything except what you earned. And you still believe you are a burden?" Her voice was steady, but I heard the edge beneath it. "From the day you came," she continued, "Lior has laughed more than he has in 3 years. I sleep through the night without waking to listen for footsteps that never come. This house no longer feels like a place I'm only surviving in. It feels like a place that might still have a future. If you leave now, I do not know how to go back to the silence that was here before you." She stopped. Her hands were clenched at her sides. I could see the effort it cost her to say so much at once. I took 1 step toward her, then another. She did not move away. When I reached her, I put my arms around her. For a moment, her body was rigid, as if she had forgotten how to be held. Then she let out a breath I had not realized she was holding and leaned her forehead against my chest. Her hands came up and rested lightly against my back. "I do not know how to be a husband," I said into her hair. "I have been alone too long. I do not know what it requires." She was quiet for a long time. When she answered, her voice was muffled against my coat. "Good," she said. "I have no need for someone who already knows everything. I only need someone who will stay when the work is finished." I closed my eyes. The wind moved around us, cool and clean. Inside the house, the fire crackled low. Somewhere in the loft, Lior was sleeping. I felt the weight of her against me and the strange, unfamiliar certainty that I was no longer standing on ground that belonged to someone else. That night, I did not carry my blanket to the barn. I laid it on the bench near the hearth as I had done once before, but this time I did not feel like a guest. Veressa did not speak again. She only nodded once when she saw where I had placed it, then went to her own room and closed the door. I lay awake for a while, listening to the house settle. The wind moved through the eaves, the last of the fire popped and faded. For the first time in many years, I did not feel the pull of the road waiting for me at first light. I felt the shape of the place I was in and the people who were in it with me. Sleep came slowly, but when it came, it was without the old restlessness. I did not dream of leaving. I dreamed only of water moving where it was meant to go, and of a table set for 3. Winter settled over the valley with quiet authority. The first snow came early, dusting the apple trees and turning the repaired ditch into a line of white against dark earth. I did not leave. Each morning, I woke on the bench near the hearth and told myself it was only for another week, then another. The weeks became months. I repaired the barn roof where the wind had worked loose a section of thatch. I built new fencing along the northern pasture using timber from the old woodlot. In the coldest weeks, I constructed a small water wheel at the head of the ditch, simple but steady, so that even in low flow the western fields would still receive what they needed. The people of Ravenmore began to speak of me differently when I rode in for supplies. They no longer called me the stranger who slept in the Orc widow's barn. They said quietly and without warmth, "The man of Thornfield." I did not correct them. I paid for nails and rope and rode back before the light faded. Leor changed first. One evening after supper, he was helping me stack firewood against the kitchen wall. He handed me a log and said, without looking up, "Father Kyle, the axe is getting dull again." The words stopped me. I set the log down and looked at him. He met my eyes for a moment, then went back to stacking as if nothing important had been said. Inside the house, Veressa stood at the window. She had heard. She did not come out. She only watched us with an expression I could not read, then turned back to the fire. Spring arrived slowly. The snow melted in patches, and the apple trees pushed out tight green buds along every branch. One clear evening, when the air still carried the bite of winter but the ground had softened, I asked Veressa to walk with me to the orchard. Leor had already gone to bed. She followed without question, a shawl over her shoulders. We stopped beneath the oldest tree, the one that had looked most dead when I first arrived. Its branches were now heavy with white blossoms that glowed faintly in the last light. I took the small iron ring from my pocket. I had forged it myself during the long evenings when the snow kept us inside, shaping it at the small anvil behind the barn until the metal was smooth and simple. No jewels, no engraving, only a circle that would not break easily. "I came here meaning only to sleep in the barn," I said. "I told myself I would fix the water and leave before anything could hold me. Then you set a place for me at your table. You let me stay when every other door in this valley would have closed. And somewhere between the digging and the quiet nights on the bench, you made room for me in your life as well." Veressa looked at the ring in my hand. Her eyes were bright. She did not speak at once. When she did, her voice was low. "You are asking to stay. I am asking to belong." She took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit. She closed her hand around it and pressed her fist to her chest for a moment, the way orcs sometimes did when they accepted something that mattered. Then she stepped forward and rested her forehead against mine. We stood like that under the flowering trees until the cold drove us back toward the house. We married in early summer. Helmar came and 2 families from the poorer edge of Ravenmore who had quietly begun trading with us. Leor stood at my side through the short ceremony in the yard. Veressa wore a simple dress of dark wool and the iron ring. There was no feast, only bread and stew and the sound of the new water wheel turning in the ditch. When the last guest had gone, we stood together at the edge of the orchard and watched the light fade from the western hills. By the following autumn, the farm at Thornfield was the strongest land north of Ravenmore. The western fields produced heavy grain. The apple trees bore fruit again in thick clusters. Travelers on the road sometimes stopped to ask whose place it was. The 2 men who had waited for Veressa to fail now rode past without slowing, their eyes on the ground. They did not stop. They did not speak. The land no longer belonged to their plans. I still rise early. I still check the ditch each morning and the fences each week. But I no longer pack my blanket with the thought of leaving. The bench by the hearth is where I sleep, and the chair at the long table is where I eat. Leor calls me father without hesitation now. Veressa sets 3 bowls every evening and a 4th when Hilmar visits. The house is no longer silent in the way it once was. I came to this place as a man who knew only how to read broken land and moving water. I thought that was all I had to offer. I was wrong. The woman who once stood at her fence with a bucket in her hand and doubt in her eyes gave me something I had stopped expecting to find on any road. She gave me a table with a place already set, and later she gave me the rest of her life to stand beside. Some nights, when the fire has burned low and Lior is asleep in the loft, I still hear the old pull of the road in the wind. It is quieter now. I listen to it. Then I listen instead to the sound of water moving where it was meant to go, and to Veressa's steady breathing in the next room. Then I stay.